in this fantastic pot of musical and vocal activity, the young Handel, many other, but the young Handel goes to that part of the world, gets a job with Prince Ruspoli, and there in the orchestra is Scarlatti himself playing the violin. There is Corelli, who had revised and changed the entire way the violin was played to more or less, I would think, a modern way of playing the violin. Pace, all those people who play funny instruments which don't sound to my ear like a Stradivarius, which is what Corelli played. Anyway, Handel learned all of this, heard the singers, worked with the singers, met the singers, went up to London eventually, got the job, ran his own opera company, hired singers that he had heard when he was in Italy, and then went other times to Italy to hear more singers. That's what happened in England. In Naples, there was constant activity in a number of theaters, but mostly in the San Bartolomeo Theater, where the great stars sang. In Venice, the same thing happened. There were a lot of opera houses, maybe 4 or 5 operating at any one year, but the greatest of them was San Giovanni Grisostomo, and the same singers, if you look at the cast, were shuttling back and forth between Naples, San Bartolomeo, and Venice, San Giovanni Grisostomo, and then Handel would come down and steal them and grab them and take them off to England for a period. All right, so that's that period. It would seem fairly likely, due to the fascination with the castrato voice in that period, that a lot of women would have imitated, never having had that kind of training either, would have imitated the kind of sounds they heard coming from the castrato voice. Let's get a little more technical. The castrato, I'll tell you a story. Many, many years ago, Fiorenza Cosotto came to my house to dinner. And I said to her, Fiorenza, I've just gotten a record of the castrato, Moreschi. I knew they existed, but I'd never seen one. This is many years ago, and one of the Moreschi records was on the long-playing record. And she said, oh, my goodness, she said, don't serve dinner, don't do anything. I want to hear this record. I know it existed for years, and I never heard it. And I said, well, it's not an agreeable sound, but it is quite extraordinary. So I put the record on, and she listened to it. And when it was finished, she looked at me and she said, I think that is the greatest vocal technique I ever heard. I said, well, Fiorenza, coming from you, who arguably has one of the greatest vocal techniques of our time, how would you define that? Why do you say that? She said, well, she said, I am proud to say that my middle voice is extremely healthy, and that I can give quite a full tone in the middle tones. But that man can reinforce the tone on the F and the G and the A flat in a way that I can't imagine doing with my voice. Therefore, I consider that a great technique of a mezzo-soprano. And then she said, wait a minute, play it again. And I played it again, and then she put her head into my harpsichord so that what she was singing would bounce off the soundboard and she could hear it, and put her hands cupped over her ears, started making all kinds of noises, and all of a sudden then turned around and came out with a middle G that seemed to peel the paint off the walls of my apartment. And she said, okay, I understand. I can do what he's doing, but he could do it for 20 years. If I did it for a month, I'd have no voice left. Now I know what the castrati offered that the woman simply cannot supply. It's not the ability, it's the ability to have a career doing that. Now, let's look at it even further. The castrati were never, except in very rare cases, were never asked to sing high notes. They really only concentrated on the middle of the voice. And the middle of the voice, of course, is what tells you, are the notes upon which all the words come. Therefore, the name of the game is declaiming the words in an expressive and theatrical way. That, I think, is probably the element that the women attempted to imitate. Indeed, we read that Senesino, Handel's first man for many, many years, had not his equal in Europe in the declamation of a recitative. Now, I read that and I was rather mystified. I never heard a recitative sung in a way that stopped the show. And then I thought, oh, of course you have. I remember at a gala performance in the Metropolitan Opera, Carlo Bergonzi came out and sang the aria from La Traviata. And when he finished the recitative, which precedes the aria, the audience stood up and screamed. That was the only time, I must say, I ever heard an ovation for recitative, but I imagine that's a kind of an echo of what went on when Senesino sang those great recitative scenes. Not about high notes at all, about saying words. And then let's remember the moment when the teacher heard his pupils sing all this coloratura music in 1710 or 12, and he said from the back of the theater, "Alas, I taught you how to sing, but you want to fiddle." All right, let's talk a little bit more about the technique of the castrato singer. The first generation of great castrati coming out of that conservatory in Naples, or Bologna, of which some Neapolitans, well, anyway. Niccolini and Senesino, these singers all had voices which stopped on the C. They basically had one octave of voice. They were contraltos. This is, of course, very reminiscent of the Broadway belt singer, and indeed is the range of a very important voice when it emphasizes the chest tone to the degree the tone could be said to be in the chest voice. Of course, I'm not saying that there should not be a lot of head resonance in the tone, but we're talking about register. Anyway, that's not important. And therefore, and words and the big belted chest voice. Then along in Naples came Porpora, composer and singing teacher. Porpora was the teacher of Farinelli, the next generation, Farinelli, Caristini, and company. What Porpora seems to have invented is the mixing of the registers and the extending of the range up to the F or even the F sharp, and therefore these men could teeter across the break in a way that didn't spoil the effective unity, which means they had what we call blended the registers. Then, of course, Farinelli, who was a miracle and cannot be used to represent a school or a tendency because it was unique. Instead of extending the voice up to F or F sharp or even G, Farinelli sang B flats, and his voice seems to have gone down to the low F. So that's something special. But at any rate, the castrati blended the registers after that, and that was the way that they continued to sing. There doesn't seem to be a very important technical change until the end of the 18th century. At the same time, the women's voices that were used in the star parts tended to be the mezzo-sopranos, the contraltos, and if sopranos, they would be the very low soprano, which might be typified, very dark soprano with a lot of power in the low and middle tones, typified by the voice of Rosa Poncell or Maria Callas even. And that kind of voice is what was called the dramatic soprano in that period. Indeed, there's a very interesting article by Lamperti, the elder Lamperti in the 1840s, in which he says the women that were called dramatic sopranos when I was young, Pasta and Colbrand, these women would today be called mezzo-sopranos. And that's who, of course, sang the lead roles in most of the operas in the 1730s, 40s, 50s, even 60s, and consequently, the higher voices were relegated to the smaller parts. We can still see this in Rossini's writing. In the opera of Mosè is an opera which I know well, and the high soprano, or the lyric soprano, sings the Pharaoh's wife. She has one brilliant aria, and it's all very charming, but the soprano lead is for the low soprano, with the important middle tones. The high soprano in the opera of Mosè by Rossini sings a brilliant but fairly unimportant aria. The important soprano part sings a lot of music, and it's very much lower.